Last time we covered the Mauser 1871 and its role in the Great War. Today we'll see a rifle that never left service, all the way through 1918. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is actually a much handier rifle than last time, although still plenty big by comparison to what we've seen elsewhere. This is the German Mauser Jägerbüchse 1871. Let's go ahead and get it over to the light box. Weighing in at 9 pounds and with an overall length of 48.7 inches, this is a bit handier than our previous rifle. It still is a single shot, firing that 11mm Mauser cartridge. Now, last time we went into deep history on the Mauser 1871, so if you haven't seen that, I recommend it, otherwise this is going to seem a little out of place. Today, we're going to cover this particular rifle, which was used in the Great War, and we're actually going to talk about another variant that really wasn't, but we had the opportunity, and the episode would be a little short without it. So, 2 guns, 1 episode, bet you're all happy with that. Now, since we don't really have to work up the mechanics of this gun, we've already done all that, let's instead talk about the utility of this variant. So who is it that needed their own special rifle? Primarily, it would be the Jägers, translating directly to hunters. Traditionally dressed in green with a shako hat, these were elite, highly trained light infantry, who specialized in skirmishing, scouting, and sharpshooting. They were much more independent than standard infantry of the day, flexible and effective. I should also mention the Prussian-style Schützen, literally shooters. These were light infantry, skirmishers who were hand-selected to be attached to the main infantry and issued rifled barrels when smoothbore was the norm. They were accomplished marksmen and meant to be kept firing and hopefully out of hand-to-hand combat where their talent was wasted. Now, the Schützen and the Jägers both came from a different need, but wound up in about the same place. They just sort of merged their evolutionary paths into one package, a light infantry, highly trained, highly maneuverable, and highly accurate marksman. And so, they required their own special rifles. When it came to the Needle rifle, they received a shortened version with a set trigger for even better accurate fire. When the Mauser 71 rolled around, Prussia and Saxony still had the practice of issuing these special shortened rifles, but Bavaria had dropped the matter with their Dreise Model 69, and Württemberg wasn't fielding Jaeger at the time, though I've read they did acquire some of our rifles today for other troops. Now, back when a rifled barrel was very expensive to manufacture and you couldn't really give it to all of your line infantry, it made sense to have a separate special rifle that you only gave to basically designated marksmen in this case. But as time goes on, this is a very accurate, serviceable rifle for anybody. And infantry itself is becoming more maneuverable and better trained as Europe gets better at, well, shooting at each other. So ultimately, the role of the Jaeger starts to diminish. And as we saw, people like Bavaria are just getting rid of the Jaeger rifles entirely. They're like, you can just use the infantry rifle. It's fine. And we're going to see in the future that some of the best rifles are just standard short rifles for everybody. But at that time, Jaeger and Schützen still had some influence, especially in Prussia, where they had their own section of the war ministry just for their approval process. And so they wanted to push very hard for their own version of the Mauser 1871. So that's what they would get, a little over 4 inches lopped off of the standard rifle. And much to Mae's delight, I am sure, semi-pistol grip. They would also add a brass backing to the front sight, although it seems most were later abandoned. It's not present on ours. Likely they proved both weak and difficult to use in bright daylight. And that really is the whole story to this gun in terms of development. I know normally we take a lot longer, but it's dang near that simple. So I can just go ahead and show you what a Jaeger is right now. So let's get it in. Alright, same action. This is all exactly as you expect it to be. The big differences come in on the length, which is a little bit shorter, kind of hard to tell by that pass by. And then our sling swivel configuration is just a bit different. Instead of being up here in front of the trigger guard, we're all the way down here at the rear. Beautiful. And then while we're here looking at the trigger guard, we have this big spur that comes back, bolts in, and that serves as a semi-pistol grip, and actually kind of a proper one. We're used to seeing spurs on rifles, and they tend to wander anywhere from like right here to all the way back. This one's actually in a very good position, I think. It really feels like a pistol grip or semi-pistol grip stock. Beautiful little feature there. And again, after that, same rear sight, same everything else, standard infantry style rifle. Not too much extra to learn on this, except, and this you'll have to get from Mae at the end of the episode, I've only actually shot this Jägerbüchse. That trigger to me feels much lighter than the regular infantry rifle trigger. But you don't have to trust my opinion alone, because like I said, Mae got to tickle this gun's fancy. So let's see how it went over. Yep, this thing is much handier than that long rifle. I mean, that thing's like 53 inches. This is much more manageable. This is sort of like the Mauser Dragoon that we saw before. I like the balance, and we'll get Mae's opinion a little bit later. But I want to talk about that because that handiness, well, imagine if you're, say, an engineer or an artilleryman. Do you want to carry around that long rifle? You do not. You prefer something like this. And so, again, kind of like the Dragoon in a way, this gun got distributed to people other than Jäger and Schützen who needed a short, handy rifle. Interestingly enough, the Jäger and Schützen would be upgraded to the next magazine rifle, leaving this, the Jägerbüchse, in the hands of people who weren't Jägers or Schützen. They were in the hands of artillery for quite a while. So yeah, with the Jäger proper, they got armed with 71 84s pretty quickly. The engineers would have to wait all the way until the Gewehr 1888. And the artillery, well, we covered what their upgrade was with the 1891. That is a lot of service time for this single shot. That means for a number of years, there were no Jägerbüchse in the hands of Jäger. They were in the hands of artillery and engineers. Kind of cool, but it gets even weirder than that as we go further into this. However, let's talk manufacture first. These guys were produced mostly by OEWG Steyr, although Mauser Oberndorf and Danzig would kick in too. Total production? Well, sorry, but I got nothing reliable. The Jägers received a special bayonet, the Hirschfänger 1871. Pioneers, the engineers, and artillery would get their own separate variants. Now, many of you are repeat fans of the show, so you understand the formula I'm going for here right now, right? I have a single-shot black powder big bore rifle. It's obviously obsolete by the time World War I starts, so I'm going to describe how it worked its way out of the Jäger's hands, out of the hands of the artillery, out of the hands of the engineers. And then it was replaced by Gewehr 88s and 91s and Gewehr 98s, and the Kar 90AZ replaced it. It's triple over replaced. And I say it's gone. They sold them all off, and there were like 500 left. And then I'm going to wind it down. I'm going to be like, that's it. That's the end of the story. There's nothing interesting here. And then I'm just going to pop my head up, and I'm going to go, but then war were declared. But something interesting here, something novel here. This gun never left active service between its introduction and 1914. Not even by 1918 had it really left service. That is a very unique situation for this show. You see, the Jäger, it just took a little boat trip. it was damned popular in Africa, where it found a home with regional police and especially with the Schutztruppe. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about the scramble for Africa when we get to the Portuguese Kropatschek. That factors in very well there. But just so you know, around about the time this gun was coming out and shortly thereafter, Europe was really getting into having African colonies. It's a lot of raw material and resources there that they wanted to borrow under threat of gunfire. So the thing is, after a while, the Europeans start bumping into each other, and they had to come up for a system of laying claim to what they own. Now, a lot of politics went into this, but the final decision was, I guess if you shoot everybody best, it's yours. So they ended up having to have good colonial pseudo-armies that were really just peacekeepers that they had to put in place to actively control their territory so that they could therefore lay claim to their territory. That means there were Germans in Africa who needed their own gun. Now, these were mostly known as the Schutztruppe. Now, these guys were fairly unique when founded because they were not from any one kingdom, but a true blended force. They were an imperial German armed body. European commissioned and non-commissioned officers, medical and veterinary officers, with nearly all enlisted men being from the local populations. Askari, as it were. Schutztruppe were big in German East Africa, Southwest Africa, and Cameroon. Now, these forces were not under the Imperial Army. For a time, they were technically under the Navy, but ended up in their own sort of colonial department. Now, these forces had the chance to buy the latest and the greatest out of Germany. They could just bring it in. I mean, the problem, though, is do they really want to? As I said, most of the troops are Askari, so do you really want to give the native population, who you only trust so far, your best weapons? We see this with the sort of Vetterli issue. Well, no, not necessarily. It's better to give them single shots because then you're only being dogged by single shots. Also, they really did have more direct control over these troops and gave them less independence. So they really still like the idea of calling each stage of the firing line one stage at a time. And that's much easier to do without a magazine. No panicked firing. In addition to all of this, there's still the issue of simplicity. If you buy the new guns and bring them in, you then have to keep parts for the new guns in, and they're way less good about being sort of hand-fixed as a gun that was partially handmade when it came out. These are very dead simple to use, no extra training, very easy repairs. Honestly, not a bad choice for Africa. The only real big problem is the black powder that you got to keep clean, but again, they are so out of date by the time we get to the turn of the century, they're practically consumable because the number one issue going for these guns is that they were affordable. Because the colonial powers for Germany, well, they were there to make money. So why would you want to add any more cost, any more overhead to your operation that you didn't need to? These weren't expected to be used against other Europeans. If that sort of thing kicked off, they'd start boating in troops straight from Germany to fight other Europeans. No, these are for suppression of locals who have, at best, muzzle loaders that they often would fill with rocks. So, yeah, this is just fine. Now, that's not to say that the European officers didn't indulge in their own improvements. 88s and 98s abound in Africa, for certain. Now, these guns still suffered the same problems as the large Mauser. They could have some heat issues and things like that, but the shorter barrel actually means that it's less likely to develop that sort of wandering zero, and the more even temperature in Africa means that once you had it sighted, you were sighted. It didn't have quite as radical as a change, except, I guess, at night. And honestly, if you're fighting with a big bulk of dudes, somebody's going to score a hit the way Africa was set up. So the big issues, not so big. There was, however, one little issue that was driving them nuts down there. And I kind of suspect it had something to do with the crazy humidity or something. They really wanted an ejector. I'm quite certain that they were having problems with pulling this guy back in case it's just sitting right there and having to grab and throw them out. So, in 1909, these guns would be sent over to Spandau to be modified and improved to have a new extractor and new ejector. Let's take a look at what that would really look like. I do not have an example here, so we'll have to do with an animation. The old left side extractor is gone, and a spring-powered one is fitted to the right. An ejector is now placed on the left side, and a notch milled into the bolt to match. That's it, but a big upgrade. Now, the first order of these would be for 4,000 in 1909, like I said. In 1911, they would order 3,500 more. In 1911, they were making improvements to this gun to be issued actively. This gun did not leave service. Now, you might notice later on we're going to have some estimated numbers for Africa. Keep in mind, only 7,500 were modified this way. Actually, the majority of them in Africa would be just like the one I'm holding. However, if you do see one with that configuration, by all means, let me know. I'd be very curious to play with one. We made that animation off of estimates because we did not have one on hand. All right, so 1912 rolls around, and they try to make a reliable, storable, smokeless powder ammunition for this particular gun for use in Africa. And it doesn't really go so well. It's just not cost effective and just not where they want to be. So the ammo starts to actually dry up a bit. And that really was going to be the big consideration for actually finally removing this gun from Africa. That is, of course, until war were declared. And let me tell you, it's a world war for sure, because we are now talking about Africa, where this particular rifle variant served in significant numbers. And the first battles it would fight, well, it's probably going to be somewhere in Togoland. It was the first to be hit in August of 1914, and it was rolled off by the end of the month despite determined German resistance to the French and British attackers. Next would be the Cameroon Campaign, lasting from August 1914 until March of 1916. This time the German forces put up a longer defense and even scored some vicious counterattacks against the combined French, British, and Belgian forces arrayed against them, although defeat was inevitable. There would be another series of battles in German Southwest Africa. Here, British forces failed in their first attempt at invasion, and the Germans countered, including air raids. But again, Entente forces would prevail. It's worth noting that this involved the first clashes of German and Portuguese forces. The Portuguese would suffer losses and surrender valuable ground and equipment, but we'll talk about that more another day. Now, in all these battles, we're talking most of the German forces are going to be Schutztruppe. And what are they really carrying? Because, yeah, they have these, but is that it? And how many? What's the percentage? These guns would suffer up to 3,000 lost a year at peacetime in Africa due to Askari coming and going and the general harsh conditions of their use. So, even if they had a ton of them, they're suffering attrition before they're even in a fight. And again, the ammo is kind of dwindling too. I mean, is this really a statistically significant gun? Well, good news, there was a 1913 inventory that we have access to. Both the Schutztruppe and police had a nominal number of the 71 long rifle as we discussed last time. If we look at the numbers for the Jägerbüchse, however, they're a little more significant. 7,127 for the Schutztruppe, and the police had even more at 8,303. Now, if we look at 98 style Mausers, so the Gewehr 98 and the 98 Carbine and the 98 AZ Carbine, all were present in Africa, and if we combine them all, because we're really not breaking them down today, that's 16,456 for the Schutztruppe and 3,148 for the police forces. Now, both of these would have to combat outside invaders, so we're just going to pump them all together, and we look at the whole picture, a little under half the rifles in Africa were actually Jägerbüchse. So, you're defending yourself from other European powers that are now trying to push through Africa, and half your arms are, well, this, an 11mm single-shot short rifle that's actually about as long as most long rifles by the time you're fighting. That doesn't sound too good, and so it's not too surprising that we see, in all of my examples so far, the Germans just being slowly routed out of their holdings. Well, that would all change for one specific man, master of guerrilla warfare, one Lettow-Vorbeck. Nicknamed the Lion of Africa, this is Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck I am speaking of. I'm not doing a full bio, but in August of 1914, Vorbeck was a garrison commander who ignored both his governor and Berlin as they tried to negotiate for an African neutrality for the length of the war. Instead, he prepared for a British invasion that did come, soundly defeating it and going on the offensive. I won't track into every little battle, but he would become the general in charge of the East African campaign, and led what many claim was the most successful guerrilla operation in history. Constantly moving, attacking, raiding for supplies, and fresh arms and ammo, Vorbeck focused not on winning, but tying down as many enemy troops as possible, keeping them from being deployed against Germany proper. While his forces never exceeded 14,000 men, and only 3,000 of those were Germans and the remainder Africans, they ultimately tied down some 300,000 Entente personnel and more equipment, a huge drain on what could otherwise be deployed against Germany. His fight would last the entire war without defeat. He would hear of the armistice of November 11th 3 days after the fact, following which he would march his men to Zambia to surrender. He had only 30 German officers left, 125 German non-coms, etc., and 1,168 Askari, with some 3,500 porters following along. Now, I highly recommend anybody take some time and really read about Lettow-Vorbeck, because it's a fascinating history, and it's actually a very complicated one. And in this show, we tend to talk about the firearms, so I don't want to get too much into this, but you have a man who did more to tie down Entente man for man than anybody else in the war. He was never caught, but the way he did it was to absolutely devastate the countryside he moved through, forcing people to be porters, raiding villages. It is a sort of scorched earth policy, and a lot of famine and disease followed in the wake of his path. So, very controversial figure in history. And in a lot of ways, that makes the history more interesting, because if you are engaged in a history that doesn't have you asking questions or making judgments in value that make you uncomfortable, then I don't think you're getting deeply enough involved in history. God knows we don't, because I'm just here to talk about nice, safe firearms, that are intrinsically designed for warfare. Nothing controversial there whatsoever. All right. That pretty much wraps up the story of the Jägerbüchse, though, because with his surrender, this gun finally left active service life. And there may have been some sales in secondary markets, but nothing significant enough to mention today. That is this gun's complete story. And so, if you're looking at the time on the clock, this might come out to be a very short episode, if not for the fact that when I emergency borrowed this, by the way, thank you, Michael, we had a huge problem where I had the 71, and I assumed that one of these was in town with someone, and it wasn't. I just imagined it or dreamed it. And so he sent this over in a hurry to get this episode done. He is an absolute hero of the show. And by the way, we also used his Gewehr 91, so he's been a hero twice over. Everybody thank Michael. All right, so this gun's clear. He also sent over something that we didn't really need, but heck, it's here. So why don't I show you this? Oh, the Karabiner 71. Let's get it over in the light box. With an overall length of 39.3 inches and weighing just over 7 pounds, this is getting to be a very handy single-shot 11mm black powder carbine. Oh boy, does it kick though. All right, so previously, let me set this back down for a second and reach over here. Previously, we covered this infantry rifle, which is so big so that you can use it as a pike if you need to. So let me just put that down. Okay, ooh, good lord. I grunted a lot. Now, we also covered this much handier, notice the lack of grunting, handier weapon for especially light infantry and then later engineers, artillery, that sort of thing. But this sort of German dragoon aside, we still have one class on the battlefield that we haven't addressed. And that, to be technical, is the horsey guys. During the Franco-Prussian War, they were still more of a sword, lance, pistol sort of guys, but times were changing and carbines were beginning to be much more appealing and present on the battlefield. So that means that they were going to make their own cavalry carbine. And as a matter of fact, that's what this was named before that 1905 simplification to just Karabiner 71. So the problem is, it doesn't really come out in 71. You see, they're trying to roll out over 1 million of the 71 rifles like we talked about, and they've got the several state arsenals that they have available running to capacity, and they've gone and put out contracts as much as possible with the sort of commercial places that they trust to keep their military secrets. And that's it, man. They filled up all production to get the rifle going. They want a fast rearmament after that Franco-Prussian War. And that means that they have no room to produce something like this. So it would have to be sort of shelved as an idea, and not even an idea. I mean, it's just a vague concept at the time. They didn't even have any plans for what it should look like. Instead, they took the resources at hand in order to solve the problem temporarily. They were sitting on a pile of newly liberated French chassepot rifles, and they could now make use of them. They converted them to their 11mm centerfire cartridge and would work them down into suitable cavalry carbines. Now, there would be several different models and even more experiments towards Jäger-style weapons. We're not getting into that today. That's a different gun. But for now, all you need to know is that these chassepot bought plenty of time in the carbine department. Now, a few years go by, and we're catching up on having enough 71 rifles, so we can start looking at this idea again. And kind of a plus, you've had the chassepots to play around with and reconfigure different ways. You basically know what you want out of your carbine. It's already been out for trials. It just has a different action, and you already know you like this action. So you can pretty much take the best features from the different types of carbines, slap the 71 in there, and you're ready to go. So that means that Spandau would have the following list available when they started this project of things that they wanted to accomplish. Not necessarily that did, but they wanted to. The length should not exceed 1 meter, and it should be as light as allowable. It's going to have an octagonal rooted barrel with a fine taper out to the front. It should have a rifle sight, but smaller, and set up kind of like the Jägerbüchse, fixed at 200, 300, and 400 meters with the slider going up from there. They wanted to have a turned-down bolt. They wanted the receiver tang to be reinforced against the splitting they were seeing on the rifles. The stock should also be as light and handy as possible, and the fittings, well, they wanted a muzzle cap like on the chassepot, 2 sling swivels, no ring, well, whoops, and an unloading rod, again like the chassepot. Samples were made and tried over and over again until they finally settled on what I have here, which is not everything on that list, obviously. The whole thing was done sometime in 1876, so a fair few years after the adoption of the 71. Again, those little chassepots really gave them a buffer space to think about this gun. So, with this guy done, let's take a look at what they really did with it. So, boop. Okay, so, turn down bolt handle is the only big difference in terms of the action, although there's no checkering on the safety. It's nice and smooth, probably a time saver. If I back this guy up, that length is much handier, and we have a nice flush nose cap and a beautifully integrated sight. Now, there is no clearing rod or provision for one. This guy would have used a pull-through for cleaning. They did not go with the rod as they expected, and they did not go with the regular swivel. They went with a nice ring. Oh, scrolling on down, we see that she's slung all the way out towards the rear. A much longer, wider sling configuration than the previous rifle, or even the Jägerbüchse, which was more in here. Definitely not up on the trigger guard like we saw with the long rifle, which, by the way, this trigger guard is fully integrated. It's one piece, unlike on the previous guns. If I get out the Jägerbüchse as an example, where it's been bolted on. So, screw, separate piece at the bottom. So this thing is actually a little bit more modern than its compatriots and works in some improvements. Now, in theory, they're less likely to split a stock, although I haven't gone that deep into this rifle. And otherwise, just an overall very, very attractive package. Now, the big difference, finally, the rear sight is no longer that jacketed ladder. It's an unjacketed ladder, and just as plain as you'd see on anything else. Although it does also have that flip-up rear. In this case, this one is extremely tight, so I'm just going to leave it be. But again, these would allow you to quick set for a few hundred more meters, or get her up and dial her in for presumably longer range pseudo-volley style shooting. Alright, I know what you guys really want. You want to see Mae shoot it. You know, black powder usually isn't that stout on the shoulder. This guy is fairly light. That's a big round to hurl down range. Makes for a very interesting and loud experience. Boom. So, let's go ahead and look at who actually made this thing, though. OEWG would be contracted in March for some 50,000 at first. They were 49 marks a pop and then later reduced by 2 more marks to 47. Mauser Oberndorf would also produce the Karabiner as they finished their rifle contracts. And that Sol Consortium from our 71 episode, well, they wrapped up their rifle production and then offered to add in some more carbines for an average cost of 37 marks a pop. That is some nice discount savings. Total production was roughly 150,000 carbines, but the solid records really aren't there. This is a strong estimate by collectors. Alright gang, that's it for the sort of quick rundown of the 71 carbine. In terms of service life, I've got nothing all that interesting. These guns really were a peacetime carbine and did not see significant statistical usage in the Great War. As a matter of fact, I really shouldn't have brought this out for this series, except for the fact that it's a chance to sort of insert the last of the 71 family and just cover it now, because could you imagine an entire episode on just that little story? All right, so let's go ahead and get this and the Jägerbüchse over to Mae. We'll get her opinion on this one, although we won't really ask her about the trenches. But this guy, oh yeah, we're very curious about what it would be like to backpack through Africa with one of these guys. All right, for you guys at home, it's been 2 weeks, or maybe just 2 minutes. I don't know if you're just going back and rewatching old episodes. Time will tell, I suppose. But for us, it's only been about 5. So, we still have room for Mae, we still have me, and we now have a different gun in our hands, the Jägerbüchse version of that Mauser 1871. And if anybody's worried about my German, I never learned German. And we deal with a lot of rifles in a lot of languages, and I only have so much time. So I'll get as close as I can, and then you guys hopefully will be able to struggle to figure out what I meant when I said that one word.
You're at least fluent in Google Translate.
Yeah, that thing does not help as much as you'd think. All right, so we have the Jaeger. I'm going to hand that over to you. This is a lot like the 71, so I'm not sure what you're going to tell us here, but let's get through the ergonomics.
So it's interesting. It is definitely shorter. The weight, of course, it doesn't have as much heft to it, which is good. It's still maintained its narrowness, which is nice. I appreciate that. It's interesting. The balance point on this one is still good, even though it's shorter. I mean, there is a little bit more weight here to the back, but more weight to the back is good. More weight forward, bad. Weight back, good. I mean, I can pull that into my shoulder. It's nice. And thank you to the semi-pistol grip, and this one's metal. So for me, it's actually a perfect fit, yet for someone who has little meatier hands like Othais, he feels a little bit squinched up in here. But yeah, for me, this feels just perfect. I feel like my hands are just posited real nice. I'm able to pull that into my shoulder perfect. I think this is fantastic. I love it. I mean, granted, as I was talking before in the previous episode, yes, I could see how this whole section, like adding it on, does slow you down when it comes to fast loading with a single shot, but it is very minute. I did want to point that out if it does slow you down at all. But I like it. I think it's a fantastic addition. I really do enjoy it. The sling swivels on this one are different. I mean, I think it is in a better place down here especially. It's kind of weird when the sling swivel's right up here near the trigger guard. It feels like that's an awkward place for it personally for me whenever they're like that. But yeah, further down here, I feel like that was a better choice. The action's pretty much the same. Like there's really no difference. And then the safety's the same flag safety, both the same manipulation on that, no real difference. But yeah, ergonomics-wise, the only real difference between this and the long rifle, obviously this is shorter, less weight, and then the semi-pistol grip and where the sling swivel is on the bottom of the rifle. But other than that, there's really not that huge of a difference.
I will say for me, I prefer this length. Easily.
Oh yeah, it does feel like this is a much better length, really.
That feels like the correct length for a black powder single shot rifle like this. Like getting shorter gets a little more difficult with things like especially the mass and the recoil in this, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But that feels good. That's like the Dragoon version when you're talking about the Mosin Nagant, you know?
That is a perfect comparison. Yes, it is like the Dragoon version.
All right, so next up, I need to talk to you about firing this thing. Any big differences in terms of, let's see, we usually do trigger, sights, recoil, that sort of thing. Does anything stand out between this and the 71 that really makes it different?
Yeah. So obviously this gun's lighter. It's easier for me to manipulate and bring it up and down from my shoulder easier. So yeah, great, fantastic. And I can shoot this longer throughout the day. So good plus there. The sights, I mean, they're the same narrow sights that they were last time. There's really no difference there, guys. Recoil on this gun, you know, I guess there should have been really a difference, but for me, I really couldn't tell. So I'm just going to say it was like just nothing really super noticeable there. But the trigger on this one, that was the biggest difference when it came to shooting on this gun for me, because it is light in terms of like, so I was thinking it was going to be similar to the long rifle in that there was going to be a good amount of take up or it was going to be super heavy. No, there is barely any take up on this gun. And then I'm just glad that my first shot that I was shooting, you know, of course you're always prepared to have it down range on your shoulder, ready to go. When you pull the trigger, you know, you better be expecting the gun to go bang. Well, this is like a modern gun. When you're pulling the trigger, you better be expecting it to go bang. The take up is so small on this one. And there's barely any cliff you feel in there for you to be pulling it through. Like, it's amazing. It's actually a really good trigger. And I loved it. It's one of my favorite triggers I have shot with to date for this series. And I'm saying that considering I've shot, what episode are we on? 70 something now? Like, goodness gracious, it is amazing. But yeah, shooting wise, it's really not huge differences I noticed, except for that trigger. That's just beautiful.
Now, I will say this is the only Jaeger that we've gotten our hands on. So I couldn't find anything in the notes. Like, once we tried the trigger, because I also pulled a squeeze on that thing, and it stands out. It's the only Jaeger I have access to, so if you have one at home, please let me know how you feel about your trigger compared to a 71, because I couldn't find anything in the literature. I know that they were designed for Schützen, so there's a chance that it was, you know, set up lighter or differently for someone who is much more highly trained for marksmanry. Or it could be that it's a complete fluke. The only thing that leads me to believing it, even though I have a sample size of 1, is the fact that there was a set trigger on the previous rifle that this replaced. So it would lend towards the idea that this was at least set up to be lighter. And if not, maybe it was modified more personally at some point. I can't say for sure. I should also probably say that this particular rifle went through Liège at some point. It's got some Belgian proofing on it, so I don't know if it got tinkered there too. So hard to say. Maybe the Jaeger has the best trigger, or maybe it's supposed to be as heavy as the others and we just got lucky on this one. Okay, so would you take this particular rifle into the trenches comfortably of World War I? And secondarily to that, if not World War I trenches, would you be comfortable marching through Africa with it against other Europeans with their own repeating rifles and small bore cartridges?
No. This gets a no on both fronts because, seriously, World War I single shot, again, that's always going to put it down into a no in my book. And then if I'm not in open terrain, what am I going to be in a dense forest terrain and then get my one shot off? No. So, yeah, no, I'm going to give it a solid no.
Yeah, all the problems that you'd have with it in the trench are the same problems you'd have with it in Africa, be it jungle or open land or whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of topography to work with there. It's a hard call in terms of it, but think of it this way. You're slower than everybody else on the field to load, and then you're creating a big plume of smoke everywhere you go. It's not,
like I said, it's like waving a giant flag. Hey, here I am, guys, right here.
Not something that you really want to get into. So, yeah, I agree with you. Neither for this. But, may I take that?
Sure.
We have another gun that was in the episode, but was not in the Great War. So luckily, you don't have to tell us how much you wouldn't take this either, because it's, again, another single-shot black. Let's be honest. We know the answer already. But could you at least talk to us a little bit about shooting this guy? Just the whole thing. Give me the ergonomics and the shooting. Let's just talk this carbine out real quick.
First and foremost, guys, this is in gorgeous condition. So thank you so much, Michael, for the lens. This is beautiful. And into the ergonomics. Yeah, this guy is adorably short, and it is super light. They still somehow maintained its narrowness. I don't know. This is perfect carbine length. Like, this is super mobile. I'm enjoying the heck out of this guy. It feels just right. The balance, it is a little more heavy to the rear. So, as I said before, I preferred a little more in the rear. It's just that's not a big concern of mine. I can pull that into my shoulder and not even sweat it. So, yeah, balance is all right still. Action is still easy to manipulate. Now, This one does have a round turn down bolt, and I've said it before with turn down bolts, I actually prefer it when they mill a little bit of the metal out of it, just so that you can get a little more leverage, stick your finger a little further in there just in case a casing jams or something like that. But with this one, it's actually not that difficult to manipulate, and I personally didn't have any problems on range with it. So yeah, just a preference. I would prefer if they'd milled out a little bit of the metal on this guy. The sights on this one, tiny sights, like super tiny, and they are still really far forward. So that's, if you're gonna make them tinier sights, please just move them a little further forward, guys, please. It's got that fixed front sight, which I really found that a little easier to read personally. I kind of like the fixed front sight. I feel like it just, I don't know what it is about the sight picture on that one. It just looked a little bit better for me, even though there is more metal up there. It was just maybe stronger, and it just was clearer, even with these sights that far forward, which was kind of nice.
I mean, to be fair, they're also a lot closer to you at this point.
That is true. That is kind of make a difference.
Now, sight radius is shorter.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, when you're 50 inches away, it's hard to read those little front beads. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
So the nose cap gives you something to sort of catch your eye, and then you center up on that, and it's just go. I feel like you can acquire those a little bit faster. Now, accuracy-wise, especially from that short notch, okay, limiting factor. But anyway, I'm sorry, you were saying.
No, that's fair. Yeah, it's still got the simple flag safety. Like, it's not that... there's really not a huge difference for the action, aside from that turn down bolt, realistically. But shooting it, there was definitely a little more recoil on this guy. It's, I guess, just because there's less mass in the gun to kind of help with that. So that definitely was noticeable. The trigger on this one is like the long boy. It is like a good amount of pull through to that one, and then it gets heavy, but still pretty even weight with the pull through. So it was still a good trigger. It was just not my favorite. I still like the Jägerbüchse. That one was pretty good. But yeah, overall ergonomics wise and shooting, it was fun. Unfortunately, this is still like, single shot. I just wish they'd had a little magazine in there, because then I'd want to take it with me everywhere.
Yeah, again, these were long gone by the time of the war. They didn't get dragged out like the Jaegers, and they didn't get picked back up like the 71s. They were just sort of out. I mean, I saw some inventory numbers with a few hundred were here and there throughout the Empire, but it's not a statistically significant gun, and it wasn't really all that specialized. And I know you're fighting that safety at the moment.
Yeah, I know.
The safety is untextured. It no longer has the serrations on it. It's very flat. And
I did forget to mention that. I do miss the texturing on it.
Yeah, it's very... They have stiff safeties, by the way. I want to point that out. If you get a hold of one and you think it's just nasty and gummed up, they're stiff. They are stiff flag safeties, and without that checkering, I find that to be a little more difficult to use. I'm unsure why that decision was felt to be important, other than possibly it was routing up on the fabric of someone who had it slung over their back for mounted use. That would be my big guess, because the Dutch did a lot of weird things like that with their carbines too, with wood panels over the magazines. So, all right, we've covered the 71 long rifle, the Jaeger, now the carbine. Not sure just yet what our next episode is going to be, but in the near future, because I don't want to create the all Mauser channel, but in the near future, we're going to talk about the same system with a magazine. And we're going to talk about 2 countries using it with a magazine, and then a third using a very similar system with a magazine. This is actually a very long-legged system, even before we get to the Mausers, that people tend to recognize. There's a lot of history with especially Paul Mauser that we still have to get into. So hopefully you'll join us back on this series later when we go deeper into these guns. But for now, I think we're wrapped out. Stay tuned after the credits for updates. And then, Mae, do you have anything for the folks at home?
Nothing tonight. Thank you guys. We appreciate all watching. And thank you, Michael.
Alright guys, as far as updates go, I really don't have anything interesting to report at all. It's just business as usual out here as we try to make our way through the rest of the series. But I do have one interesting piece of news, which is that we have a good friend in Fledermaus. He's done a lot of work to help promote the channel early on, He's a regular advisor for me in our private time, and somebody that's been on YouTube a lot longer than we have. We appreciate his help, and so actually, Mae did the photography on this poster of items that he has shot for his show. And in addition to that, since we helped him set up the poster, he's sharing some of the profits from this run. So I put a link for Indiegogo down in the description. If you are a fan of Tauflader Mouse or you like this sort of thing, go check it out. It also supports us a little bit. But otherwise, there's just not a lot to say right now. It's probably going to be more boring stuff. You know how this show goes.